What's up, everybody? What it do, man? Hope all is well. I got something I'm gonna do a little different today. For those that don't know, aside from me doing YouTube stories on certain type of topics, I'm also a writer, and I got several books out. You should go check them out. You put Eon Williams in the type search. Go to Amazon or go to eonwilliams.com. Lord and Legends is a book that a lot of people seem to like. That's one of my favorites, so you can start with checking that out. I want to send a big shout out to all the subscribers. The YouTube channel is growing. I appreciate that. I'm catching on real good, but it wouldn't be nothing without the subscribers, without the supporters, man. I salute y'all. I appreciate that. And subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification button so you get all the stories when they drop. Hit the like button. Share the situation. So anyway, we're going to get into this right here. This is the Godfather story. The Godfather. When it comes to street legends, some are sensationalized, some are demonized, and some are so elusive they are only mentioned in passing on newspaper clippings and law books like the Federal Reporter. When it comes to Washington, D.C. street legends, some come from all parts of town like hip-hop artists in New York in the 1980s. If you go back to the 70s in the annals of the street legend history in D.C., one of the biggest names you'll run across would probably be Linwood Gray, reputed to be DC's most influential heroin dealer of the decade. Lawrence Slippery Jackson allegedly led a 300-member gang that was connected to the Genovese crime family out of New York. In the 1980s, the murder trial of Eddie Mathis gave birth to the legend of the Godfather of Washington, D.C. Born in D.C. General Hospital on November 9, 1953, Eddie Jerome Mathis is a lifelong Washingtonian. Originally, he came from the Garfield Projects off of Stanton Road Southeast. His family moved to Northwest D.C. when he was 9 years old. Most of his younger years were spent uptown. The 900 block of R Street became his neighborhood. Like other kids in the neighborhood, young Eddie went to Bruce Elementary. His infamous reputation as a leader began before he got out of grade school, according to many that knew him growing up. Ed was a leader way back when we was in grade school, says Moose, a childhood friend of Mathis. He ain't take no stuff. We used to fight all the time over little stuff like cupcakes, Moose jokes. But he quickly remembers more serious times. Ed had a look he would give you that would put the fear of God in a person, Moose remembers. I'm talking about as a youngster too, like 10 and 11 years old. You could tell he was going to be special. It was at 11 years old when Mathis had his first real run-in with the law. The year was 1964. It was a time of black power, black unity, and civil rights fighting. Washington, D.C. was known to be a tough city at the time, especially in its urban pockets. Mathis allegedly stabbed 2 boys for trying to take his bicycle. He was later arrested and sent to the receiving home, a juvenile lockup for district youth. After a month in lockup, Mathis was released to his father. Once known to law enforcement, Mathis was arrested and incarcerated a number of times throughout his teenage years. It was during these years that he began to forge bonds and friendships that would serve him well for the rest of his life. Most of the notable street figures that come out of Washington, D.C. either met or reunited in the district youth lockups like the receiving home or the National Training School. It was actually these same juvenile lockups that spawned the likes of other notable D.C. street figures like Raymond Cadillac Smith and Keith Fly Gaffney. As a teenager, Eddie Mathis began to make a mark in the district's underworld, according to law enforcement. Mathis was a fast-thinking, quick on his feet, inner-city teen of the time. You couldn't tell him nothing. He was a mean, flat-foot hustler that did it all, according to numerous sources. Playing con, pickpocketing, dinging cash registers, boosting, and even a little pimping were a few of the street hustles in the 1960s. Mathis is alleged to have been involved in all of the above. Childhood friend Moose remembers those days vividly. Eddie was a bad man, he says. We did a few things together back when we was young, picking pockets, running a little con. By the early 1970s, the streets of Washington, D.C. had grown increasingly violent. Eddie Mathis' name began to circulate in armed robberies and extortions, according to police records and street sources. He'd grown into an 18-year-old smart force to be reckoned with. on all levels. Guns had become the order of the day. Stick-ups and robberies became Mathis' so-called thing. It wasn't long before the law closed in on Mathis and he was taken off the streets. He was charged with a number of crimes and eventually sent to Lawton's Youth Center, where he would end up spending 3 years of his life. Lawton's Youth Center 1 was a gladiator school of young men from the District of Columbia, sentenced to the Youth Rehabilitation Acts. The facility was a medium security institution that housed offenders between the ages of 18 to 21 years old. The Youth Center, as it was called, was a breeding ground of aggressiveness, violence, and brutality. It was also flooded with drugs, drug dealing, and power struggles over the lucrative drug markets. Riots, knife fights, and overcrowding plagued the prison. Mathis was released in 1974, but it wasn't long before his name began to surface again to law enforcement. On the streets, people used to say that he used to do a lot of stick-ups back in the day before he started getting real money. Street sources say Mathis was suspected in the robbery of a big drug dealer and other hustlers all across the city. Eddie was extorting all over the city big-time dudes. Some say he got on extorting, a friend recalls. The street stories of Mathis are too many to verify or confirm. But what is a known fact is that at some point in 1975, Mathis had a run-in with the law that resulted in a shootout. Backing out of a well-known numbers house with his gun blazing, Mathis ran into the office of the Metropolitan Police as they responded to the call for shots fired in the area. In an attempt to get away, Mathis exchanged fire with officers. He was later arrested, tried, and convicted of assault with a dangerous weapon and assault on a police officer. He was sentenced to 3 to 9 years for the assault on a police officer and 40 months to 10 years on the assault with a dangerous weapon. The sentences were ran concurrently. Mathis was sent to Youth Center 1 in 1975. The center was plagued with overcrowding, drugs, and extreme violence. On more than one occasion, prisoners were found stabbed to death and placed back in the bunks to be discovered by officers at count time. Some prisoners were even caught in possession of thousands of dollars in cash. By all accounts, the center was truly a place where only the strong survived. Mathis allegedly hit the compound running around like a chicken with his head cut off. He ran with the infamous group of legendary convicts that formed a brotherhood while doing time at the center. Names like Mummy, Peachtree, Fly, Brodus, Ashby, Eggy, Michael Fray Salters, Wilbert Cook, KK, O, Tony Harris, Buster, Dusty Face, Huck Slaughter, Mike Fowler, and Wildman, just to name a few names. This same group of comrades would later form a crew called the Youth Center Mob, years later at Lawton's Central Facility, The Hill. Most of them made a pact to hit the streets of D.C. and get some real money once they got out. According to a number of accounts, that is exactly what most of them did when they returned home. As legend has it, Mathis' partner, Fray and Wookie, went home a few months before he did. They were able to lay the foundation that would all build their names and reputations upon release. Once Mathis was released from prison, he joined his partners and they allegedly put their plan in motion. Things were slow at first. They started from the ground floor with $700, according to sources that were around at the time. The crew struggled for a minute as they tried to figure things out. They then decided to bring in Mathis' main man, Khaled, aka Paul Dixon. He was just what the doctor ordered. Things seemed to take a turn for the better once Khaled joined the operation. An around-the-clock sort of thing was allegedly put into effect, and money began coming in from all directions like something out of a movie. The word on the streets was that they were on top of their game. According to court records, Mathis was leading a vicious group of drug dealers that controlled the biggest share of the district's heroin trade. Their operation was allegedly based in the area of 9th and U Street Northwest and was reportedly bringing in as much as $500,000 a month. More than $1 million a month in today's money. It's not a joke, says Moose. Eddie was living large. He had 5 Benzes, 2 houses, an Eldorado, a yacht, you name it. He was the man. Everybody know that. Court records confirm that the feds raided a home that belonged to Mathis and seized over $1 million in cash. Nothing good lasts forever. As fate would have it, Mathis's friend, Michael Fray Salters, was taken out of the equation for a minute when he went on the run for a murder in an unrelated case. Myron Wookie Thomas also ran into legal trouble and was sent to federal prison. Mathis and Khalid remained the last two standing for a sort of time, but that would change late one September night in 1981. According to D.C. Superior Court records, Marks Roscoe Moxie Jackson was a Washington-based drug dealer with a reputation of a man to be reckoned with in the streets of D.C. Most people that knew Moxie considered him a gangster of his time as well as a known money getter. In a late-night altercation outside of the Game Plant restaurant in Southwest Washington, Moxie allegedly pulled a pistol on Eddie Mathis in front of a small group of people, men and women included, said prosecutors. "I'll blow your head off," Moxie barked at Mathis, according to the trial transcript. "If you're going to kill me," Mathis responded, "you better do it now." For whatever reason, Moxie didn't kill Mathis that night, according to the prosecutor, who described both men as dangerous drug dealers. 3 weeks later, according to the testimony of Deborah Jones, a cousin of Mathis, Moxie had to be dealt with for disrespecting Mathis. Jones testified on the night of September 24th, 1981, she visited a relative's house where she had dinner. After dinner, she went to the upstairs apartment of Harry Jackson and Irma Turner. A short time later, Eddie Mathis, Larry Mathis, Harry Jackson, and Paul Dixon showed up. They all left the room together for a moment. When they returned, Eddie Mathis allegedly asked Jones if she wanted to ride with the men to take care of some business. Jones agreed to go along to take care of the business. Larry Mathis drove with Harry Jackson and Eddie Mathis in Mathis's Mercedes, while Dixon drove with Jones in his yellow Thunderbird to an unknown woman's apartment somewhere in Maryland. At the apartment, each member of the group armed themselves with guns. Jones further testified that she and a group of men then headed into D.C. When they got to the area of V Street, between Georgia Avenue and 8th Street, Northwest, Eddie Mathis allegedly gave the group instructions about their roles in the business. The group dispersed to handle the business, according to Jones. She was instructed to park on 8th Street and to watch Paul Dixon's back. She allegedly followed Dixon through an alleyway towards 9th Street. The shooting began almost instantly. Jones testified that she heard gunshots and saw Eddie Mathis firing a gun into the driver's side window of a parked car. At the same time, according to Jones, she saw a man make a hostile move that was not with the group that she came with, and she fired at that man and watched him fall to the ground. Paul Dixon, Jones alleges, was at the rear of the parked car when she fired. Jones and Dixon then ran back to the yellow Thunderbird and fled the scene, later throwing their weapons into the Anacostia River. When the smoke cleared, Moxie Jackson lay dead, slumped over the stern wheel of his late model car at 9th and U Street Northwest with 4 bullets in his head, shot close range. The FBI soon got involved. Other murders allegedly followed. Eddie Mathis and Harry Jackson were eventually apprehended. Paul Dixon would later be murdered before he could be arrested. Larry Mathis stayed on the run for some time, according to the United States Attorney's Office. An informant provided information in May of 1982 that Larry Mathis had learned that the law enforcement were closing in on him and that he was soon going to be indicted along with his brother and Harry Jackson. According to the informant, Larry Mathis was going to have the prosecutor murdered in the case. The FBI quickly began to focus their attention on Larry Mathis. Months later, Larry Mathis was in custody, and he, Eddie Mathis, and Harry Jackson proceeded to trial for the murder of Moxie Jackson. The murder trial in front of Judge Fred B. Hughes was marked by never-before-seen security measures in the courtroom at the time. A bulletproof glass partition separated the participants of the trial from the spectators. Everyone entering the courtroom was checked for weapons. A dozen or more U.S. Marshals stood guard over the defendants throughout the entire trial. The prosecutor had Marshals escort him everywhere he went, including home. Witnesses were placed in witness protection. The government's case rested on 3 witnesses: Deborah Jones, Mathis's cousin and admitted accomplice to the murder. Michael Thompson testified that he witnessed the shooting as he emerged from Harrington's Club on 9th Street and recognized Mathis as the killer. Robert Dickory testified that he had known Mathis for years and that Mathis was the shooter the night of the murder. Eddie Mathis was represented by a well-respected lawyer at the time by the name of R. Kenneth Mundy. In defense of Mathis, Mundy highlighted gaps and inconsistencies in the government's witness testimony. Their testimony conflicted regarding the number of shooters, their sex, who had on a mask, who didn't, where the shooter stood during the shooting, which side of the getaway car 2 of the shooters fled in, and where weapons were disposed of. Robert Dockery, who testified that Eddie Mathis was the shooter, had his testimony thrown into question when it came to light that he was hiding under a car when the shooting allegedly began. He also misidentified the passenger in Moxie Jackson's car as Deborah Jones when it was actually a woman by the name of Tawana Mayo. Michael Thompson's credibility was undermined by the fact that he was a drug addict and was secretly given all kinds of concessions by the government to testify against Mathis. He made his identification of Mathis under the influence of heroin and alcohol. Deborah Jones received drugs, money, and a new identity from the government, as well as immunity for her testimony. Assistant U.S. Attorney Mark Byros focused most of his case on Eddie Mathis, calling him the Godfather of the D.C. drug trade. He claimed the motive was respect. Mundy argued the government's case was inconceivable and made a point to highlight the fact that the government witnesses were unreliable. After 2 weeks of testimony, the government brought the case to a close. The jury deliberated for nearly 3 days and came back with a decision. Larry Mathis and Harry Jackson were found not guilty. Eddie Mathis was found guilty. After the verdicts were read, Mathis reportedly smiled and waved to family and friends in the courtroom as he was led away by U.S. Marshals. He would later be sentenced to 20 to life and sent off to federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. Federal prison has never been a nice place to be, and in the early 80s, the racial tension and geographical beefs made life inside United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, aka the Hot House, very serious and even territorial. Eddie Mathis, being a black prisoner from Washington, D.C., was automatically viewed as a D.C. black, a term the feds use to identify black convicts from D.C. that are considered problem inmates. Aside from taking care of himself and staying focused on survival, Mathis stayed on top of his case. He knew he had 20 years to do, but he knew for sure that he was never going to lay down and give up his freedom. His appeal was in as soon as possible. However, before he could get all of his issues together to appeal his murder conviction, he found himself in the hole under investigation for another murder. A white convict was found stabbed to death, and the prison administration needed someone to place the blame on. Accused of the stabbing death of another prisoner, Mathis was transferred to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, aka the Southern Tip. Marion was a maximum security prison and housed some of the most violent prisoners in the country at the time. It was built, some say, to replace the United States Penitentiary Alcatraz. Marion was also the same prison where the notorious war between D.C. blacks and the Aryan Brotherhood, aka the ABs, exploded after the murder of Raymond Cadillac Smith. Mathis would spend the next 5 years in Marion, but he was hard at work on his appeal. Finally, his hard work seemed to pay off. In August of 1986, the D.C. Court of Appeals reversed Mathis's murder conviction. D.C. murder conviction overturned was the headline in the Washington Post. A 3-judge panel ordered a new trial for the 32-year-old Eddie Mathis. The panel ruled that due to impermissible comments and the relative weakness of the government's case, that Mathis was entitled to a new trial. Judge Herbert B. Pear wrote for the panel, citing several remarks by prosecutor Mark Byros during his closing arguments, including repeated references to Mathis as the Godfather. A new trial was set. Mathis remained at Marion until the trial date. At his new trial in 1988, Mathis was acquitted and released from prison after close to 7 years behind bars. When Mathis returned to Washington, D.C., the city was a different place. The war on drugs was on the nightly news, with young black males dying and killing in drug wars all over the city. Crack cocaine was being blamed mostly. Mathis was able to keep a low profile for a short time, according to law enforcement sources. However, DEA files have Mathis right back into the thick of things in the DC underworld. Aside from other notable names that were ringing in the streets, Mathis's good friend Michael Fray was the talk of the town. Law enforcement sources claim Fray was one of the city's largest drug dealers at the time, with drug operations along Kennedy Street Northwest, stretching from North Capitol Street to Georgia Avenue. They claimed that Fray had grown so powerful and influential in the streets that he had the power to referee street beefs and turf disputes among drug rivals. Eddie Mathis and a crew of his was allegedly allied with Fray and his crew, according to DEA sources. Together, the two groups are said to have controlled large sections of the city's drug trade. According to John Cornally and other DEA accounts, Fray and a few close comrades of his, including Mathis, met up with Rayful Edmond and a few of his men, as well as a few men from the Trinidad crew, in order to find a way to stop the killing. District authorities attribute more than 30 murders to the so-called beef. Agent Cornally claims that Fray got the two groups to agree to stop all the killing because it was bringing too much police pressure and heat, as well as slowing down cash flow all over the city. Crime rates from the time confirmed that the killings in question stopped after the 1988 meeting. Another federal source said that Fray and Mathis got the two groups to give their word on the ceasefire. If either side was to break their word and continue the killing, Fray's crew and Mathis's crew will unite and crush the violator or violators of the so-called ceasefire, according to FBI sources. After all, according to the feds, Fray had a good reason to want the ceasefire. Federal drug sources allege that Fray pooled money with Rayful Edmond and Tony Lewis to buy cocaine from their Los Angeles connect, who had the pipeline connect to Colombian drug distributors, according to Cornally. On the other side of town, in far southeast, Mathis had his own thing going on, and it was going well, according to law enforcement. Police sources claim that Mathis put a team together months after he returned to the streets and then quickly took control of a portion of southeast and nearby Prince George's County. Federal authorities paint a broad picture when they claim that Mathis and his crew were running one of the largest heroin distribution organizations in the district at the time. Unfortunately, according to police, something went very wrong, and a bloody wave of violence tore through a 20-block area of southeast. Mathis's crew was blamed for much of the violence by law enforcement. The Washington Post documented the violence in the Washington Highlands neighborhood and called it a bloody drug rivalry. According to police records, 20 or more people were murdered in the 20-block area centered on the 800 block of Bellevue Street Southeast. Dozens more were shot and wounded in gun violence. A task force, the Repeat Offenders Project, was formed to put a stop to the bloodshed. Task force members, along with other federal authorities, began to conduct raids all over the Washington area looking for shooters in the feud. Law enforcement officials said the feud was one of the most violent street beefs to hit the district since the feud between Rayful Edmond's crew and the crew from Trinidad, where more than 30 murders were attributed to that turf war. Task force members conducted raids all over the Washington area looking for Mathis. They spotted him one day as they were returning to the office after one of their raids. Mathis was identified as the driver of a pickup truck carrying 4 men. Task force members pulled the truck over and swarmed with their guns drawn. Mathis and 3 men were allegedly wearing bulletproof vests and carrying firearms. They were all placed under arrest. In Washington, D.C., the February 1990 arrest of Eddie Mathis was big news in the streets as well as in the newspapers. He was a convicted felon back in jail on gun violations. For sure, he was going to go away to prison for a very long time. Some in law enforcement also believe that Mathis's time as a force to be reckoned with in the DC underworld was over as well. Mathis was sentenced to 15 years in prison as a career criminal. However, it wasn't that simple. Mathis ended up pleading guilty to gun violations under the impression that the court was going to grant him some credit for years that he had spent in prison for the Jackson murder, which was over 7 years. The judge in the gun case even made reference to the fact that it could be an issue at sentencing, giving the impression that the 15 years would get reduced to something in single digits. After the judge made it clear that he was going to give no credit for the time Mathis already spent in prison for the charge he was later acquitted of, Mathis attempted to withdraw his guilty plea. The judge refused to allow the motion and sentenced Mathis as an armed career criminal based on convictions of his that dated back to the 1970s. In their haste to give Mathis a large sentence, the government miscalculated one of his old convictions as a violent conviction. Mathis appealed the 15-year sentence. Shipped off to federal prison, 2 years would pass before the Court of Appeals would rule on Mathis's conviction. However, in 1992, the appeals court overturned the conviction due to the fact that he wasn't really a career criminal according to the law, and therefore reduced his 15-year sentence to just 84 months. With his sentence reduced from 15 years to 7 years, Mathis was once again released from prison. On March 18, 1996, he walked out of FCI Ferrenton in New Jersey and was placed on an ankle monitor for a few weeks. Once again, Eddie Mathis was a free man, and he returned to the DC area quietly. Other than family and close friends, no one really knew what Eddie Mathis was up to when he hit the streets again in 1996. According to the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C., they were keeping tabs on Mathis, along with federal authorities. D.C. police began to circulate an intelligence bulletin to warn and remind law enforcement in the D.C. area that Mathis was back in the area and that he should be taken very seriously. At the very top of the bulletin, in bold letters, the subject read, "Violent offender alert." On the second page, the bulletin read as follows: Since the early 1970s, Eddie Jerome Mathis has been involved in criminal activity. He eventually rose to be the alleged head of a major narcotics distribution organization in which he and others maintained discipline with savage ruthlessness. During the 1980s, a task force of homicide, narcotics, and intelligence investigators established that Mathis was directly involved in or personally participated in 14 homicides in just over 2 years. Mathis was tried and convicted of murder in 1981. The conviction was later overturned on appeal, and Mathis was released in 1989. Mathis was recently released from prison after serving a sentence for carrying a pistol without a license. In the past, Eddie Jerome Mathis allegedly headed major narcotics distribution organizations in the Waller Place and Bonnie Streets area of far southeast, Potomac Gardens public housing area in the 1st District, and in the area of 14th and Florida Avenue Northwest. It would be the investigation of another individual that would officially put Eddie Mathis back in the crosshairs of law enforcement. Through federal wiretapping, DEA agents learned that Mathis was bringing in large amounts of heroin from New York. Months of investigation led federal authorities to believe that in or about May of 1996 that Eddie Mathis, with the assistance of Maurice Lee, reestablished an old drug distribution network in Southeast DC. From that point, authorities say that Eddie Mathis brought cocaine and heroin into the Washington area through different out-of-town suppliers, and then sold it to other drug distributors, including one Eugene Matthews, who then resold the drugs on the streets of D.C. According to court records, on March 8, 1997, DEA agents acting undercover ordered 250 grams of heroin from Robert Andrews, Eddie Mathis's father-in-law. A drug courier by the name of Vladimir Perez delivered the heroin to Andrews from a New York supplier by the name of Miguel Castro. After Perez delivered the heroin, he and Andrews were both arrested. They both eventually pleaded guilty. However, Perez began cooperating with the government. Perez identified Castro, Rodriguez, and Eddie Mathis as drug co-conspirators. On July 9, 1997, DEA agents arrested Castro as he was preparing to sell Eddie Mathis 300 grams of heroin. Castro pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges and cooperated with DEA agents by making several monitored telephone calls to Mathis to arrange a drug deal. Castro later set up that deal, and the trap was set for Mathis. Court records show that on August 20, 1997, Mathis sent his nephew, Maurice Lee, to pick up a shipment of heroin, and he was arrested by DEA agents. Federal authorities put out a warrant for Mathis, but he was nowhere to be found. According to law enforcement, Mathis went on the run and slipped into hiding after the arrest of Lee. Federal authorities also learned that sometime in the summer of 1997, Eddie Mathis found a way to contact Rodney Patterson and Terry Kelton, two prisoners inside the United States Penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. According to the DEA, through Patterson and Kelton, Mathis was able to arrange a drug deal with another Lewisburg prisoner by the name of Peter Coley. Little did Mathis know that Coley was a government informant and had already agreed to assist federal agents in setting up drug deals with Mathis and any other target they could take down at the time. DEA agents monitored a number of phone calls where Coley spoke on the phone with Eddie Mathis and his brother, Walter Mathis, in an effort to set up drug deals. With the help of DEA agent Samuel Bates, Coley put together a drug deal that was to go down at the Landover Mall in Landover, Maryland. On November 5, 1997, Bates and an undercover Baltimore City police detective carrying 5 kilograms of fake cocaine met Walter Mathis and D. Smith at Landover Mall. A short time later, Walter Mathis sent Smith to go get Eddie Mathis. 15 minutes later, Smith returned to the mall in a gold and tan Geo. Eddie Mathis stepped out of the Geo to the surprise of law enforcement. Smith left the mall once Eddie got out of the Geo. Bates showed the fake cocaine to Eddie Mathis, who, according to Bates, replied with nothing more than a okay. DEA agents wasted no time making their move. Closing in from all directions, DEA agents arrested Eddie and Walter Mathis. Less than an hour later, DEA agents tracked down Smith's gold and tan Geo, parked in front of the Glen Arden Apartments, adjacent to Landover Mall. Federal authorities located Smith inside their apartment. They also found a loaded semi-automatic handgun magazine. They then searched the Geo again and found a loaded handgun in the glove compartment. The government secured a 6-count indictment against Eddie Mathis, Walter Mathis, Lee, and Rodriguez, charging them with 1 count each of conspiracy to distribute and possess with intent to distribute heroin and cocaine. Individually, Eddie Mathis was charged with 2 counts of possession of heroin with the intent to distribute and 1 count of possession of cocaine with intent to distribute, along with money laundering. The sole testimony linking Eddie Mathis to the conspiracy came from Eugene Matthews, a witness with a long criminal history who began to cooperate with the government in an effort to receive a reduced sentence in a pending federal case. Matthews testified that in September or October of 1996, he met with Eddie Mathis, Walter Mathis, and a man by the name of Larry Clemens to make a $4,500 heroin deal at the International House of Pancakes restaurant at Landover Mall. On May 22, 1998, a jury found Eddie Mathis, Walter Mathis, and Lee guilty of conspiracy. Eddie Mathis ended up getting 24 years in federal prison for drug conspiracy. Life waits for no one, and the show goes on. On October 30, 2015, Eddie Mathis was released from federal prison. His life has been full of ups and downs, but through it all, he has always walked away through whatever storm with his head held high and his dignity intact. Many of his friends and associates describe him as one of those guys that are just cut from a different cloth. From the time he stepped off the porch as a child, he vowed to be every word that he spoke, be it good or bad. He's the live and let live kind of guy, but just don't get in his motherfucking way, by all means. Eddie Mathis is the last of a dying breed, and those that know the history of the streets of Washington, D.C., he will always be the Godfather. Free the real.